Okay, welcome back. Hope you had a nice dinner and break. Let's just take a moment once more to refresh our motivation. And we can't do this often enough in some ways because it is a very positive state of mind that we're trying to create. And this is really helpful for our minds to think that what we're being guided by, the ideas that are informing our being here, are really very and positive, wholesome. They will have fruit that will be in line with that. These positive actions will bring forth positive results. So, again, the result that we are aiming for is ourselves finding deeper peace, contentment, joy, happiness. But not to do this for ourselves alone, not to be that selfish, but to recognize again the interdependence and the fact that we are all in this together and all beings are just like us. So, can't we be here as well for them? With a mind that embraces their welfare in the same way that we embrace our own. And this is ideally our motivation. Again, in Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, we sort of package this as what we call bodhicitta, the mind of awakening, the mind that aspires to develop ourselves completely so we can be of perfect benefit to other beings. Very magnanimous, beneficial mind. And then let's open our eyes fully and we'll continue. So let's get back into forgiveness. I was spending, the latter part of the session before this going through the Buddhist understanding of forgiveness, where it comes from within the understanding of karma. And the idea is that we then have compassion for others because we see that they're creating the causes for their own suffering, not just suffering, for ourselves or others, that we're forgiving them, for that behavior, but we're also understanding that they are creating the conditions, as it says here, for their own future suffering. That is holiness shared. There's a book by Victor Chan. It's actually Victor Chan interviewing the Dalai Lama, spending time with him, called The Wisdom of Forgiveness. And His Holiness relates a story of a young Tibetan boy there whose father fought the Chinese and who was beaten with an iron rod by one of his Chinese captors. I'm not going to share the full story with you. In some of these, when I've had more time, I would do that. But the essence of the story was that these Chinese guards knew that this young boy was the son of Tibetan uprisers, somebody who was really quite opposed to the Chinese. Even though he himself hadn't done those actions, they decided to beat this kid with iron rods. And His Holiness's point of view was he really understood the interdependence of this and was able to look at these Chinese guards through that lens. And the essence of it was kind of like he says, okay, they are doing these actions, but why are they doing these actions? Why would they take metal rods and start beating a Tibetan boy? Well, because they've been ingrained through the propaganda of the Chinese government to have this attitude towards Tibetans, to think that what they are doing is wrong and that they are in the right, and so on. And the whole chain was like understanding that what is arising in this act of somebody, these Chinese guards beating this young boy, was all a product of causes and conditions, and all a product of, a myriad number of factors that are feeding into it, and having the understanding again that at the level of the essence of those beings, the Chinese guards or the Tibetan boy for that matter, is this natural purity. It's just been layered on top of it all of this garbage, all this stuff that we buy into, that society influences us to think, and everything is, we're a product of all of that. And again, that is a part of our karma as well. All these causes and conditions that shape who we are. It's a bit of what you were sharing, I think, Lindsay, in some of your comments. We're not happening in our own little tight world, but rather we are a product of everything that is around us and the thoughts that we buy into and the things that influence us and so on. So when we see it through that lens, once more, interdependence is one of the main teachings of the Buddha. Because if we understand that it's not some isolated thing, that there's this horrible person called a Chinese guard or whatever, person that we're talking about as the the being that is in the focus here, and they're not just an independent thing arising from themselves. They're arising from so many other factors. And we can understand then that if we are give the opportunity to change some of those factors and to begin to influence people in different ways, we can actually change those beings. Again, not that we're the ones that are actually going to do the changing, but we can become a catalyst for that change. So this is the gist of what His Holiness shared with Victor Chan, was just having a deeper understanding in the teachings on independence as to why these sorts of things happen. And in talking about it at the end, maybe I did share most of what was in this. First, I was angry, he says, and then I actually felt sorry for the officer. The officer's action depends on his motivation. His motivation depends on propaganda. Because of propaganda, the counter-revolutionary father of the boy is seen as evil. Elimination of evil is something positive that the Chinese officer was trying to do. You can't blame that person, he says. So, thinking along this line, instead of anger, forgiveness and compassion came. Interdependence gives you the whole picture. This happens because of that, and that happens because of this. Clear? So again, when we see anybody who is a wrongdoer or is going about things that are causing difficulty and suffering for others, try to see them through that lens, that they're not some sort of independent, inherently evil being that is created on their own. They are a product of a variety of factors that have contributed to the way that they are and the way that they think and the things that they do. And the people that even maybe facilitate them doing what they're doing and what have you. And so many things happen. So it's an important perspective to have. It's not just, again, the karma thing, but also understanding the myriad numbers of causes and conditions. So then His Holiness said to Victor Chan, the essence of Buddhism, one side compassion, one side viewpoint of interdependence, which is really what we often call the wisdom aspect of Buddhism. Compassion and wisdom, these two wings of a bird, they often talk about them being like the two wings of a bird that allow the bird to get to its destination. What allows you to get to enlightenment in Buddhism is these two, compassion and wisdom. And he says, and I always tell people, it's very important to make the distinction between the actor and the act. We have that in Christianity too, right? Hate the sin, love the sinner type of thing. I don't know if it's quite the same concept, but it's similar. We have to oppose the bad action, but that does not mean we are against the person, the actor. So this is already giving some hints of what we're going to see in terms of forgiving doesn't mean condoning wrongdoing at all. It's acknowledging that what they did was wrong and that we are going to nonetheless forgive them for that because we can make a distinction between the person who's doing the action and the action that they're doing and decry the action while still having compassion for the person. Forgiveness, Dalai Lama continued, and this is where we're getting into what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean also forgetting. It does not mean we forget. I need to talk about this a little bit. I've had some questions when that comes up. Forgiveness not meaning forgetting. It says you should remember the negative thing, but because there's a possibility to develop hatred, we mustn't allow ourselves to be led in that direction. We choose forgiveness instead. So when we say remember the negative thing, we're not meaning dwell on the negative thing and think that that's what we have to carry forward. Yes, it's remembered, but just in the sense of acknowledging that it's something that person did that is wrong, that again we can be opposed to, but we will still choose forgiveness for the person. We'll see that they are not their actions. They are the creator of their actions, but they're creating their actions through ignorance. So again, we're in a sense blaming the delusions, the states of mind that cause that person to do those actions. The Archbishop was also clear about this. Forgiveness does not mean you forget what someone has done, contrary to the saying, forgive and forget. Not reacting with negativity or giving into the negative emotions does not mean that you do not respond to the acts or that you allow yourself to be harmed again. We're going to see this when we get into the technique of forgiveness that is taught by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mpo, that you don't allow yourself sometimes to be harmed again. That's part of the process, and that's important. And if we have the perspective of compassion for the wrongdoer, well, why would we want to put ourselves back in a position where they continue to do harm to us? Because that's not good for them. It's not a healthy situation for them to be in. So again, we don't forget in the sense of, not completely ignoring it, but we also don't hold on to it like we're holding on to that coal, waiting to throw it at the person to get our revenge. On it meaning not allowing wrongdoing. I already touched on this a few minutes ago, but he says, I would like to add that there's an important distinction between forgiveness and simply allowing others wrongdoing. Sometimes people misunderstand and think forgiveness means you accept or approve of wrongdoing. No, that is not the case. This is an important distinction. Again, now, how do we kind of avoid the wrongdoing of others? How do we cause them to not do that? As I mentioned, we do have, of course, um, prison system that does take offenders and remove them from society to a place where they can um, have that barrier to not continue to do actions that would be of harm to others. And there's some benefit to that. But as I said, it's not a perfect system by any means, and one where we would ideally want to supply people with what they need to be able to work with their minds so that when they are back in society, they don't engage in those actions again. But we don't want to once more fall into that kind of extreme of using violence to counter violence. Using things that would be very harmful to the offender that would then, just create more violence in the world. So it's a tricky one. How do we stop wrongdoers from doing wrong? In Buddhism, unless you change some way that they are looking at things, and again, many other factors, as I said, the whole social justice issue and making sure that people have what they need. Many people are engaging in some criminal acts and what have you because they don't have the resources that they need. They never got the education that they needed, and so on. Many things that have fed into it. We're living in a society with great injustices when it comes, especially again, to people of color and so many other people who are disenfranchised in our society. So, again, work on those sorts of things as well. Recognize it's very complex. It's very hard to stop people from doing wrongdoing, from engaging in behavior like that. But we have to keep mentally at least that distinction. What they did is wrong, but they're not bad people, horrible people, evil people, awful people. Again, society tends to hold that view. I even found the way that prisoners were treated in the prison system was pretty demeaning. I found them all to be people like me, essentially, and just a few wrong turns that could have happened in my life, and I could have potentially been in prison. I mean, I'm not saying I'm some horrible person in terms of the behavior I've done, but I'm saying that it's all a product of causes and conditions, as His Holiness was pointing out. If we were in the wrong place at the wrong time and our emotions got out of control, who knows what we do in a particular situation? All right. Another comment. We stand firm against the wrong, not only to protect those who are being harmed, but also to protect the person who is harming others, because eventually they too will suffer. So it's out of a sense of concern for their own long-term well-being that we stop their wrongdoing. All right. Then the third of these, it doesn't mean weakness either. So what do you say to people, Douglas Abrams asks, the Dalai Lama, who say that forgiveness seems like weakness and revenge actually seems like strength? I think again, we're seeing that in what Israel has done, revenge upon Hamas for what they did on October 7th feels like the strong thing to do. If we don't do that, if we don't, take revenge, then we're showing ourselves as weak. Okay, so this is what the Dalai Lama says. There are certain people who act out of the animal mind. When someone hits them, they want to hit back, retaliate. And he made a fist, kind of pretending to hit himself. With our human brain, we can think, if I hit back, what use will it be in the short term or in the long term? The thing is, I don't think people really think about the consequences of their actions, even beyond the short term. What's been, I'm sorry, I don't want to get too political about the situation in Israel, but so disconcerting is that there just doesn't seem to be any kind of, even if they're going to use violence in these ways, what's the end game? Where is it that you're headed to? What is it that you're trying to achieve? By making angers on anger through anger, actions of anger towards all the nations that surround you, how is it going to help the situation? What's the vision that you're holding for what it looks like in the long term? So it is totally wrong, cutting his hand sharply through the air to say that practice of tolerance and practice of forgiveness are signs of weakness. Totally wrong, 100% wrong, 1,000% wrong. Yeah. It's actually, it takes a lot to go against the feeling of revenge, the feeling of wanting to get back, the feeling of wanting to put that person, that nation, whatever, those people in their place. And we have a culture that supports that. We were talking earlier about movies and everything else that are just all about getting revenge, having that victory over the oppressor, over whatever. And, there are ways to achieve victory over oppressors. Again, look at what Gandhi did in India. It was slow, steady, nonviolence, day in and day out, and eventually change happened. It's not the quick way necessarily, but it's the best way. I have all those casualties and everything on the side that are a product of all of the crazy stuff you did trying to achieve that. So it's important to remember these sorts of things. If we choose to retaliate or pay back, the cycle of revenge and harm continues endlessly. If we choose to forgive, we break the cycle. We can heal, renew, release the relationship. Again, that's an important thing to emphasize. So I don't know, maybe I don't know if I want to read this whole story. There's a wonderful story that Jack Kornfield relates in his book about that kind of exemplifies the strength and power of forgiveness. The essence of it is that he was Jack Kornfield was on a train one time, I think in the DC area, and he was talking to a man who was a social worker for young juvenile offenders. And there was this young man who had taken the life of another young man. And in the court hearing, when he was getting sentenced in that, the mother of the victim whose life was taken by this young man, stood up in court and said, "I'm going to kill you." And young man was sent off to prison and, was going through all of his process in prison and everything. And she started to visit him, and she would show up and just visit with him and talk to him a bit. And then she'd start bringing in cigarettes and things that he needed. And then it came time for his parole. And she actually, asked him, "Well, what are you going to do when you get out on parole?" And he said, "Well, I don't know yet. I haven't really figured that out." And she says, "Well, why don't you come live with me?" And I'm sure he was probably thinking, "Well, what's all going on here?" Well, he ends up getting out of prison, goes to live with her. And essentially, the gist of it is one night they're sitting there. I guess she even found a job for him, all these other kinds of things. One night they're sitting there and she says to him, "Remember the time in court when I said I'm going to kill you?" He says, "Yeah." And she says, "I did. That young man that took my son's life is gone now." And sorry, I get teary-eyed on these things. And now, you're here, this person who's, again, very different than the person who took her son's life. And she even asked him to stay with her, to kind of be the son that she lost. I mean, that takes a lot. If you can imagine losing your son, I hope no one in this room has had that experience, but to lose a child, especially a victim of violence, and then to be able to befriend and even invite in and make them a surrogate of your lost child. It's huge. I first read that story, I just couldn't get over it. I mean, you don't want to believe these stories because they sound so outrageous. But I think there are those courageous people who can do that, who can say, it doesn't make much sense. I've lost my son because this young man, apparently he didn't have anyone else to go to. He didn't have a family. He was a product again of the circumstances and conditions that led him to be like that. And she saw that and she said, this is calls for forgiveness and compassion. This doesn't call for me to, do horrible things to him. Anyway, um, so there are various teachings on how to engage in forgiveness. I'm going to present briefly the process. Actually, I forgot to pull up this document. Let me pull that up first so that there is a couple of documents that you have in the drive that are two different techniques of working with forgiveness. The first is the fourfold path of forgiveness, which is comes from the book of the Archbishop and his daughter. Then we have the other one, which is Jack Kornfield's. And Jack Kornfield's one, I also have some notes on that forgiveness meditation that I'll touch on very briefly. Again, on a weekend course, I go through all of those rather extensively. But I'd like you to have those just because I think they do fill in the meditation a bit more. Because the meditation as it is a bit basic, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it helps to have some additional things that we are attending to as we go through the meditation. So let's pull up the fourfold meditation practice. Okay. So in the book of forgiving, this process kind of helps us to move from a position of anger and resentment to one of forgiveness and inner and outer peace. This is a very different technique than what we might use in Buddhism, but there's some validity to it. The first is telling your story. And this may not be telling your story to the person who harmed you. You might have to work with a neutral person, a friend, what have you, to tell the story first, because we're not always ready to confront the person who has harmed us. And sometimes it's actually not a good idea to confront the person who has harmed you because it could lead to further harm. Yeah. So telling your story, as it says, this is you talking and talking and talking about what has happened. Sounds a little kind of maybe too much, maybe it's kind of strange karma we're creating, but we need to talk about the pain, the fear, the details. Get the story out again and again to help with you processing the event so you can come to a place of forgiveness. It's kind of a form of acceptance to some degree. If we actually talk about the story, put it out there, use our words to express it, well, then we are accepting it. This is what has happened to us. It helps you own the story, as it says there. Again, I'm not going to read all the words, but I think this is helpful in terms of an initial step. Naming the hurt, besides telling the story, the facts, this happened, then that happened, and whatever, it's very important to name your hurt. When we bury our true feelings, we only seem to suffer even more because of it. So it is important to bring that out as well. It mentions here this happens a lot in grief where we kind of bury our feelings. People stop talking about the deceased. No one wants to mention their name. And we have a culture that has really almost given permission to bury our feelings in regard to a lot of situations. But if we bring those up and we surface them, not to create, again, the other emotions that come with it, the anger and frustration, whatever, and exacerbate them, but to simply acknowledge the pain that we feel, the ways in which we have suffered from what has transpired. You know, to really name that, give voice to that. Granting forgiveness. Now, again, Jack Kornfield's meditation is a deeper process of working with how we move into that space of forgiving the person who has harmed us. And once more, that may not be with the actual person who did that. That may be something we do on our own or something we do in the presence of others who can be a witness to what we are saying. But we have to get to a place of being able to absolve is a weird word, but to be able to forgive, let go of the any kind of resentment or any negativity we feel towards that person. Again, it doesn't mean we condone their action. It means that we are simply going to provide the space in our heart for forgiveness. And he says there, it's easy to say I forgive you, but incredibly hard to mean it. Just like we say I'm sorry so frequently, right, when we apologize, but do we really mean it? There's a whole book on apology. It's actually called On Apology by Aaron Lazar that I've read that's really quite interesting. And no one teaches you how to apologize other than say, I'm sorry. But they actually say a complete apology has got many more elements to it. And I think we have to take these things like forgiving and apologizing much more seriously than we do in our culture. We tend to just say, oh, it's no problem. Oh, I forgive you. But maybe there's still some resentment in there that we're hanging on to because we haven't really gone through a process to deal with that. And we say, I'm sorry when we've offended others, but we don't necessarily mean it. The last step, renewing or releasing the relationship. After you've gone through some process of getting in a place of forgiveness through repeatedly looking at that, can we forgive? Can we forgive? And then eventually feeling like we've gotten to that place. Even again, if we have not done that with the person, we may find that that's useful if the opportunity affords itself and it's appropriate. But once more, we shouldn't put ourselves in danger or go back into a situation that could be harmful because we may be harmed and the other person may engage in harming behavior. And renewing or releasing the relationship is the choice that we make. It's not up to the other person who's been the offender. That's the label again we're giving to them in this life. Maybe in another life we were the offender, they were the victim of that. But we are going to make a choice whether we want to renew that relationship, go back into relationship with that person, and restore our, being with them in whatever way we can, maybe injured to some degree, but nonetheless, having a renewed relationship, or whether we release it, whether we simply say, I forgive you, and yet I don't necessarily want to be your friend anymore. I don't necessarily want to be with you again. Again, there are extreme situations, once more, of abuse and things that people have been involved in. And this isn't always going to look like some smooth process and what have you, where there needs to be a lot of care taken to make sure that people don't end up in abusive relationships again. We should once more think about it from both standpoints. We don't want to be in a situation where we are harmed, but moreover, we don't want the being who has been harming us to do that again because it's not good for them. This process, I can't say I've used it a whole lot. This is actually from a website where somebody was kind of recounting it. I don't know even the creator of this per se, but the forgiveness meditation by Jack Kornfield is one that I tend to use more frequently. And it's actually a threefold process. And I think there's really usefulness in this because I do think that we often don't think about even forgiving ourselves. We do a lot of things that are stepping on the toes of others and harming them in a variety of ways to what we say or do. But how much do we look at ourselves through that lens of understanding that our actions and the things we do are different than we are? The actor and the acts are very different things, and we can have compassion and forgiveness for the actor ourselves and yet acknowledge that what we did is not good, is not fruitful, is not something we would want to do again. So there's a little kind of recitation of things that you can say there at the end after you go through a thought process of feeling the sense of forgiveness for yourself, the things you've done to harm others, and then repeating to yourself, as it says at the end of that paragraph, for the ways I have hurt myself through action or inaction, out of fear, pain, and confusion. I now extend a full and heartfelt forgiveness. I forgive myself. I forgive myself. These are similar to the way that some of these meditations and Jack Kornfield, the insight traditions that they're set out. But feel free to change the words to something that speaks to you. You don't have to use these exact words. Each of these has words at the end that can be used if they speak to you. We're still working with the things we've done with the second step, and this is the sense of acting forgiveness, asking forgiveness of others, but it's not once more necessarily sitting down with the person that we've offended and asking to be forgiven, apologizing and what have you. Though if that feels appropriate, that might be a good thing to do. I think often it is the right thing to do. How much time do we really take the time sometimes to go to that person and say, I really need to apologize and ask your forgiveness for what I did the other day? And really be heartfelt in our acknowledging that what we did was not right, was not something that we would want to do again. But, that's the step that we can at least do on the cushion. So once more, there's a little thought process to go through. And then to each person in your mind who you would like to seek forgiveness from, you say, I ask for your forgiveness. I ask for you to forgive me. The third one finally gets to what the archbishop and his daughter were talking about in the previous, one where others have harmed us. Cultivating forgiveness for those who have hurt or harmed you. So again, we acknowledge that there are many ways that we've been hurt by others, abused or abandoned, knowingly or unknowingly, all the steps there. Now say to yourself, I now remember the many ways others have hurt or harmed me, wounded me, and so on. I've carried this pain in my heart too long. To that extent that I am ready, I offer them forgiveness. To those who have caused me harm, I offer my forgiveness. Again, this is all a meditation. It's you sitting on the cushion, working with them in your mind. If it feels appropriate to go to the offenders who have caused you harm in your life, then by all means, that can be a very healing step. But I would do the meditation first, especially, again, I don't know everyone's personal history. So if you have a history of being abused or some trauma in your life that you feel that that's a huge thing to try to forgive the person who was the perpetrator of that, then work on the meditation first. Get to a place where you feel really comfortable in your own sense of forgiveness. And then again, you may still get to a place where it's comfortable and you feel like you've forgiven them completely in your mind from your side, but it still may not be appropriate for you to go to them because it all depends upon the situation. I mean, I've even heard from many people who say like they got to a place and they went to somebody and they said they forgave them for something and the other person had completely forgotten it, and they were almost like annoyed that you remembered it. You know, you were kind of coming back after whatever period of time and almost putting it in their face by forgiving them. I mean, people get reminded of stuff that they've maybe suppressed or done something with, that is it's gone. It's not something that's at top of mind for them, even though it's been a little thorn in our heart for many, many years. So we have to be careful about this, and approach certainly if you're dealing with a situation where you do want to forgive someone and you're afraid that they may become volatile or harm you again, have a third party there. Someone that you can trust that can be a witness to it and can be a bit of a barrier if anything does start moving in that direction to make sure that it doesn't. But don't put yourself in an unsafe situation. Again, they're going to harm you and commit, actions that are not beneficial for them, and then you're going to be the butt of that harm. I did, as I said, put together notes on the forgiveness meditation. Each of these I give like a little more detail. First, what is self-forgiveness? A definition or a description that came from, in this case, Rick Hansen, a researcher on neuroscience and what have you. Why do I need to forgive myself? A little quote there. I'm not going to go through all this, but there's a little process, as I said, right there. How do I forgive myself? I would encourage you, if you feel comfortable with this, to look through this process and to maybe bring those thoughts to mind before you do the I forgive myself kind of, affirmations to yourself at the end of that section. Then asking forgiveness of others, the second part. What is the nature of that? Why is it necessary? How do I do that? A similar process, but again, worthwhile to spend some time on that before you do that. And then for this one, I have a couple of points that I took from Jack Kornfield's book. Forgiveness is not weak or naive. Remind yourself of that when you're going through this process of forgiving others. It doesn't forget the past. It doesn't happen quickly. That's important to know. If it happens quickly, it's probably not really heartfelt. Forgiveness doesn't mean that we have to continue to relate to those who have done us harm. And in the end, forgiveness simply means never putting another person out of our heart. So I've got some quotes there that I think are worthwhile reflecting on when we get to the place where we feel like I'm ready to entertain the idea of forgiving others. Then I have a little quote from the Dhammapada again. Boy, I've got a lot of quotes from the Dhammapada in this lecture. He abused me, he struck me, he overcame me, he robbed me. In those who harbor such thoughts, hatred will never cease. He abused me, he struck me, he overcame me, he robbed me. In those who do not harbor such thoughts, hatred will cease. I think that comes right after or just before that wonderful thing that I shared earlier of hatred never ceases through hatred. Um, and then how do I do that? Again, just some advice about doing this within your own comfort zone, not taking on more than you can handle, making sure that you attend to your own feelings as you go through a process of this. Again, there may be many things that we feel like, oh, maybe I don't need that much process for it. And that may be true. I'm not saying that any time that someone offends us through something that we have to go into a 3-day period of meditation and all these things and, whatever. But there probably are some things that have happened in our lives that we maybe need to do that. And that's a good part of getting through our own healing. And then we can perhaps extend some forgiveness to someone else. But those are the techniques that I've found that I wanted to share with you. But by all means, if you have other things that you've relied upon, um, then you're welcome to use those. Any questions on that? before I go back to the slides and we finish off forgiveness? I think there's recordings of me teaching on all of this stuff, if the full forgiveness kind of workshop or weekend, but I don't know. I'm not trying to plug myself for my teachings, but if you feel like you need more on that, they are out there. Again, this is Jack Cornfield's that we just went through. Um, I'm just going to put it out there. Is there a story of forgiveness that you have heard or experienced that touched your heart and that you would like to share? Or maybe even a story where forgiveness didn't happen and how difficult that was to watch or to witness or to have in your own. Uh, yeah, Aaron. I just think it's good. We do some of these other stories, but I think it's really good for us to share our own individual experiences. Please.
I hope this is helpful.
Oh, okay. I'm sure
It's
it will
been
be.
a lifetime of getting to this place.
Hmm.
And even still, I think there's so much more to learn from it. But um, so my dad was abusive. And I think, of course, I went through the whole process of anger, frustration. I think anger really lingered for quite some time.
Mm,
Kind of like,
sure.
it seemed like the most appropriate one, actually.
Hmm.
But what I realized is it was having an impact on my other relationships in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
so I kind of understood that that needed to change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think during the pandemic, I started doing a lot of work thinking about intergenerational trauma.
Hmm.
And I started to develop empathy for my dad, which felt like a breaking open a little bit to help me kind of stop thinking about myself and what I experienced and take it a step further and start thinking about him
Mm.
and what he experienced with his dad. He was abused by his dad.
Interesting.
And then I took it a step further, which was what his dad went through during the war.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of taking it step by step by step a little bit further, I think just kind of relieved me a little more because it gave me some distance
Hmm.
from the direct experience I had with my dad
Hmm.
and got me to a place more of relief and empathy, I guess.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and just to be clear, I think that it didn't happen like in the way that you showed that chart of like someone's growth going like this. It felt like that lady, like in a,
Drowning
yeah,
all over the
exactly.
place.
Exactly. Highs and lows all around and trying to get to a place of more stability in myself.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, I don't think I can't confront him with it.
Mm-hmm.
So in this way where it said releasing the relationship,
Mm-hmm.
I had to get to that point where I'm still interacting with him today,
Mm-hmm.
but it's on my terms and
Mm-hmm.
I have boundaries around it.
Good.
And I think we have the best relationship that we will ever have,
Mm-hmm.
or the best relationship that I think I want to have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if this is helpful at all for others to think about like
It is.
just moving, how to m- help yourself a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more and letting letting go a little bit of that tight grip that is the anger that of course is you're supposed to have that. That's part of being human is having that anger of like, why me?
Mm-hmm.
you know but
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Aaron. I really appreciate you sharing something so personal. That's really very kind of you to share that with all of us. Thank you. I think, again, His Holiness in that slide when he was talking about the Chinese officer was saying at first he was angry. I don't think anger, again, it's a natural response when we see the harm that is inflicted on others or the harm that is inflicted on us. But I love what you did in looking at this kind of generational thing because it's like similar to what His Holiness did, right? Too, we have to look at, well, why is that there? Well, because of this, and why is that there? Because of this, and you follow these things backwards, and you see that, yeah, there's plenty of pain and suffering and things that have gone around. You know, releases it in a sense by already looking at the whole thing. And I don't need to comment on your comments. They were very much appreciated. Thank you. Anyone else? Did we have someone else who wanted to share? Mary, please.
Thank you very much for sharing. It helps a lot. Um, is that an example of karma? When you
Yeah,
go back, when
yeah.
you were able to go back and see what affected the person beforehand.
Mhm.
So, and it helped you understand a bit
Yeah.
and be compassionate in that regard. Is that cool?
Yeah, I mean, it's a part of karma for sure, and what tends to happen, they say, is that again, if we engage in a particular behavior, then that becomes a habit we carry into another life. And so frequently what may occur is because, okay, I'm gonna talk about it. Please, it's not just your situation, I'm just talking about in general how karma is formed. But if you have a relationship in one life, say life A, where you have the perpetrator and what we call the victim. Again, these are the labels we put on that based on what is happening in that life. That there are then the tendencies have been implanted in the person who is doing those actions to do those actions again. But chances are the person who they are doing them to was doing them to someone else, that they are now on the receiving end of those sorts of actions. So then in another life, they will manifest as the opposite, and you will have the victim who now being or the perpetrator being the victim and the victim being the perpetrator. And this is how it kind of keeps cycling around. And we keep going through different iterations of it, because if you're engaging in the action, you're going to be the recipient of that type of action yourself. That's one way that karma ripens. And then the other way is that if you are doing the action, you create the propensity to do that action again. So those two interplay with each other. We do the action again because we've done it before. We receive the effects of that action by being harmed in that way. And until you break the cycle, until somebody wises up and gets out of it, then you're going to keep creating that. You're just going to keep, and it happens on with nations. I mean, talk about Israel and Palestine and what's going on, and in that, you've got people potentially. I would say there are people who are being reborn on the other side. They have done injustice as an Israeli towards the Palestinians, and then they experience the Palestinians who are, are receiving that from the Israelis. So they were perpetrating harm on these people, but then they become the people who are the harm is being perpetrated on. And then they may take rebirth again as people who are doing that harm. I mean, I'm not trying to get into the politics of Israel and Palestine. I'm just using that type of an example. People fall on those sides of the fences depending upon what karma is ripening at that time. But those are two results of karma. When you engage in an act of harming another being, you are going to create the cause for you to have that harm yourself, and you're going to create the cause to do that type of harm again in the future. And they interplay, and they will keep weaving in and out of your relationships with various beings because you've done it in the past. And it makes some sense. I think. I think karma makes a lot of sense. It's a logical way of looking at things. We are the products of what we have done. And it's sad as hell. I mean, don't care. I'm not trying to look at it so objectively that it becomes something that we just kind of shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, that's the way it is. It's horrible that beings keep doing this, but they don't know what they're doing. That's why, again, knowledge of karma is so central to the Buddhist approach, is understanding it. I'm doing these things through the actions I do. I'm going to then experience these results. I'm then going to keep doing these things again and again. I need to break the cycle. And forgiveness is a good part of that, to say, okay, I'm not going to hold that revenge mind and wanting to get back at the person who harmed me, because it only creates the force by which that will happen in the future. You will do that sort of harm, if not in this lifetime, in another lifetime. And moreover, you're going to be harmed in the future then again. Goes just back and forth, just keeps producing the same sort of result. Talk about that phrase, right? Insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. It's what karma is really happening, how it's happening in our lives. Sorry, I'm losing my bit of my articulation of words late in the day, but that's why I often don't teach in the evening. I want to do like meditations or practices or something where I don't have to say as much. But again, thank you for sharing that, and thanks for your question, Mary, because it's definitely a part of it for sure. But to the extent that we can resolve these things, at least in this lifetime, the things that have happened, and I admire you for the way that you've resolved it and made a decision that, yes, I'm going to be in a relationship under certain terms, but it will not be in a way where he will harm and where you will be experiencing that harm. Nothing wrong with that. That's good boundaries. That's an excellent way to approach it because it's compassion for both. It's an understanding that if you put yourself in that situation, you're inviting him to do that harm, and that's not good for him as well. Any other comments or questions? Anyone online? Anything they needed to share? I want to share one little story that I heard in a BBC documentary. It was about the death penalty in the United States. Of course, we still have a national death penalty, which I find just unconscionable. And then many states that still have the death penalty. And we just had a number of people who were executed in this country who there was strong evidence that they were innocent. And that's a whole nother element of the death penalty. But in this documentary, there was one scene where there was a woman whose, I think it was her sister or brother, had been killed by this person and he was going to be executed. And so they talked to her before she went into the execution to be a witness. And they said, how are you feeling about going in there and everything? She says, well, I'm kind of nervous about it, but she says, to tell you the truth. And then she kind of looked around and she went into her pocket and she pulled out a piece of paper. She says, I'm not supposed to bring anything in with me, but I have this piece of paper that says, I forgive you. She unfolded it and showed it to the camera and that. And she says, and if he apologizes for what he did in taking the life of my brother or sister, whatever, I will hold this up and say, I forgive him. And in case they interview her after the execution, she comes out and says, so did you show him the sign and forgive him? She says, no, he didn't apologize, so I didn't do it. And I was like, oh my gosh, you missed an opportunity there to extend forgiveness. I mean, this is one of the things is if it's really forgiveness, I think we can forgive even if the other person isn't apologetic. Because from our side, we have an understanding of wanting to release that, wanting to let that go. There is a question, do we forgive for the other person or for ourselves or for both? Primarily, it's for ourselves. Why do we want to carry around that hurt and that harm? Be captive of that person for the rest of our lives, as was said earlier. Even if they're not physically there, you're still going to be captive of them mentally because you miss that precious opportunity. Anyway, I felt kind of bad. Maybe that, don't agree with how I felt, but Patrick, yes, please.
About forgiveness leads to joy, right? And then you said also do it for yourself because you get rid of the anger. And it also made me think, if would you say that if you are practicing forgiveness, that you're also planting the seeds for people to be will forgive you, but just some sort of aspect there. Is that true?
I would think so. I would think so. Again, that would be maybe the karma of forgiving is that we become forgiven more when we offend others through our actions. I don't see why it wouldn't be, but I think it's also just a good practice regardless of whether others are forgiving of us, just to recognize that again, it's taking charge of our own minds and our own feelings about the harm we've experienced from others. And I feel fortunate in my life that I've never been on the receiving end of great harm, that or it's even harm to those that I love. I can't imagine what it's like, for example, the parents of children who've been gunned down in these school violent, shootings and what have you, to be able to, but we did see that amazing example of forgiveness in the Emmanuel, can't remember the full name of the church in South Carolina, First Emmanuel Church, whatever, where it was a black community and there was a white man who came in and he pretended that he was just interested in their Bible study and whatever. And then he pulled the gun out and shot down many of them. And the very next day, members of the community that survived came out and said they forgave him. It felt a little too quick to many people. But if they were really practicing what Christianity teaches, which is forgiveness, and if we were practicing what we, adhere to in terms of Buddhist thinking around it, we would be that forgiving that quickly because we'd understand it. Well, this is why it happened. We have a way of framing it. And this is what is most beneficial to do is to forgive. So I don't know. In answer to your question, I think, when we forgive, I think we are creating a very powerful action and an example for the world sometimes, or for those who see our forgiveness of others. And it can have a peripheral effect on them, but I would think the karma is there for others to be as forgiving of us as we are of them. Um, Starting to sound like the Lord's Prayer. I think, may it forgive that. Forgive that are their trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's amazing how I have these prayers kind of the recesses of my mind. um, Beautiful prayer in its own way. It's kind of interesting that forgiveness is talked about there. Let's carry on. Let's move on, because we do want to get into, we've got 3 left, and they're the really juicy ones. I mean, obviously, forgiveness, we spent a bit of time on, so you can see that we're getting into this. Again, I went through, no, I didn't go through the actual sheet, but let me just touch on it again. You can reflect on the nature of forgiveness, examining how much your own experience is in line with what we've talked about, either from a Buddhist perspective, what His Holiness says, what the Archbishop said in terms of the slides I shared. But is that your feeling about forgiveness or not? And I think it's worth thinking about, just not taking, oh, Don said it, so I think it sounds right. Then work with one of those meditations, the Fourfold Path of Forgiveness, Jack Kornfield's meditation, as best as you can. Be really gentle with yourself, and once more, fake it till you make it kind of thing. Here's my little Winnie the Pooh. I loved Winnie the Pooh when I was a kid. It was a wonderful book. The book series that A.A. Milne did. Piglet noticed that even though he had a very small heart, it could hold a rather large amount of gratitude. So gratitude is the next subject. There's a lot of stuff around gratitude, it seems, happening in circles. uh, Greater Good, the organization run out of UC Berkeley, has a lot of stuff around gratitude. Every day, think as you wake up, I am fortunate to be alive. I have a precious human life. I am not going to waste it. Of course, this is one of the main meditations that is taught towards the beginning of our path to Buddhahood, is to really think about the preciousness of this human life. Now, again, that's within the context of rebirth, and that we could have ended up as a cockroach or as an elephant or a zillion other creatures, beings in different existences and what have you. A human life is said to be incredibly precious because, as I mentioned, I think last night, we can do amazing things with this human mind that we have, this intellect that can investigate the nature of things and look at changing our minds. And we can do makes huge strides in our spiritual practice when we have a human life. If we're born as, I love little Tashi. Tashi's very cute, but if we're born as little Tashi in our next life and have a little dog mind and dog body, we're not going to make much spiritual progress, probably. It's up to our owners to, recite things to us and try to plant some seeds in our mental continuum. But I've never seen a dog or a cat that can meditate, can learn how to, develop compassion for other beings. It's just not going to happen. So this is definitely the Dalai Lama saying this, grounded in the Buddhist teachings around acknowledging the preciousness of our human life. Douglas Abrams says the topic was gratitude, and it was fascinating to see how often the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama stopped to express their gratitude for each other, for all who were making their time together possible, and for each and everything that they were witnessing. Gratitude is the elevation of enjoyment, the ennobling of enjoyment. Gratitude is actually one of the key dimensions that Paul Ekman, remember when I listed those slide after slide, gratitude was one of them on there. The gratitude we might feel at somebody doing something, for us and what have you. But again, there is an elevation of enjoyment that happens with gratitude. It's a really wonderful practice. Gratitude is a recognition of all that holds us in the web of life and all that has made it possible to have the life that we have and the moment that we are experiencing. Thanksgiving is a natural response to life and may be the only way to savor it. And we're going to see some quotes from Brother David Standel-Rast, who has done a lot of publishing of stuff about gratitude, videos on gratitude and what have you. And he calls it gratefulness, which I actually like better than gratitude, that idea of being grateful, full of gratitude, These are the topics that are discussed in the book that I again picked out for discussion. Gratitude for the opportunity life affords us. for life's difficulties even. We've already talked about, reframing our mind, accepting our suffering and whatever. Can we be even grateful for our suffering, our difficulties, for our enemies? The relationship of gratitude and forgiveness. This was talked about a little bit, especially in regard to Anthony Hinton's experiences in prison. I'll talk about that a little bit later, or maybe tomorrow. I think I'll get to it tonight. How gratitude connects us, and gratitude in overcoming what we call negative bias. Scientists have identified that we live often with a very negative bias and seeing kind of the things that are wrong and all that, which it's kind of hardwired, again, not completely hardwired, but something we have culturally from our days on the plains in Africa and what have you, when you needed to be very mindful of threats and dangers in the world around you. And anyway, we'll talk about that, how gratitude can help us to overcome some of that is part of our sort of, animal brain, if you will. Brother David Steindl-Rast, a Catholic Benedictine monk and scholar who spent a great deal of time in Christian-Buddhist interfaith dialogue, has explained, it is not happiness that makes us grateful. It is gratefulness that makes us happy. Kind of a nice little thing to meditate on. It's not happiness that makes us grateful. It's gratefulness that actually makes us happy. That brings us joy. Yeah, to be really grateful for what we have in our life. I'll tell you a really brief story about Brother David Steindl-Rast. I only met him once. He was in the Benedictine monastery right down the way near Esalen on Big Sur. Carmelite. Is that I think so. I think that's the name of it in every way. Yeah, but it's a Benedictine monastery, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that's it. But he would come over to Esalen. I happened to be at Esalen. This was after my first partner died in 1992. He died of AIDS, and I decided that I needed to do something within the months after that to kind of, we spent a lot of time out backpacking in nature and what have you, and I really needed to be in nature to process my grief. And they were doing a week-long kind of, I don't know, being in nature. It had a spiritual kind of connotation to it. Again, wasn't even studying Buddhism at this time, but I just was drawn to doing this. So I was down at Big Sur at Esalen, and I was doing this, several day thing. And one of the nights came down to dinner there at Esalen, and the course leader was there, and I sat with him, and then Brother David was right across from him, and he introduced me to him. And it was really kind of interesting. He asked Brother David, I guess Brother David knows a lot of poetry and things. He says, would you mind sharing a poem with us, Brother David? And Brother David shared this poem by W.S. Merwin. It's called Separation. And it's, your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. And I just kind of fell apart. I don't think he knew that I was grieving, that I was in this active grief around my partner having died. And he was somehow intuitive and knowing that was the right thing to say. It was a pretty magical experience. Anyway, sorry to share that, but it's kind of it was a very special thing to have him say that. Obviously, I remembered the poem, got all the information because I think it's something that, that's what I was feeling. Everything I see was stitched with its color, with my absence of my partner. Anyway, Brother David, I think, is a pretty evolved being. Let's put it that way. Maybe he's what we would call a Buddha. Every moment is a gift. This is Brother David's words. There is no certainty that you will have another moment with all the opportunity it contains. The gift within every gift is the opportunity it offers us. Most often it is the opportunity to simply enjoy it, to be with it. But sometimes a difficult gift is given to us, and that can be an opportunity to rise to the challenge. So he uses this language around it that's a little bit different. It's maybe not so Buddhisty, but that gratefulness is manifesting in the form of seeing this moment, every moment, as an opportunity that life is affording us. Of course, the teachings that you get very shortly after, I think the very next topic in our stages of the path to enlightenment after precious human rebirth is, guess what? Death and impermanence. That we don't know when that chain of moments is going to stop, when we're actually going to have no more moments in this life. And so the preciousness of every moment being a gift, and we're thinking of it that way, It's an opportunity. And we're going to use one of his practices. I've got another little handout that I'll show you a little bit later. That is a really interesting practice to work with gratitude. Use it frequently. Acceptance means not, this is Douglas Abrams talking again. Acceptance means not fighting reality. Gratitude means embracing reality. It means moving from counting your burdens to counting your blessings, as the Archbishop had recommended, both as an antidote to envy and a recipe for appreciating our own lives. Whatever life gives to you, Brother David Stundleross says, you can respond with joy. Joy is the happiness that does not depend on what happens. It is the grateful response to the opportunity that life offers you at this moment. I kind of like this because, again, it's very Buddhisty, because especially this whole idea of mind training I talked about earlier today, where we can even see that there is an opportunity in the garbage, the stuff that's happening to us that we don't want to happen to us. In fact, it's said by the Dalai Lama and other great spiritual teachers in our tradition that you need that garbage. You need that stuff happening if you're ever going to really develop all of your compassion, all the, everything that you need to go all the way to enlightenment. If we're never challenged by things going on in our lives that are antithetical to what we want, we're never going to really grow. I remember one of my friends told me once that he found that he never really grows unless he's outside of his comfort zone. Right? I remember seeing one little graphic that said comfort zone. It had a circle with that, and then it said outside of it was where I grow. You don't grow in your comfort zone so well. We think we do, because we like to stay kind of in our little bubble, in our little world, just doing what we do. But you only grow when you're outside of your comfort zone. That's an opportunity for growth, and that's something to be grateful for. What Brother David is saying is, look at all of these opportunities. Every single moment, regardless of what's going on, is an opportunity to grow, opportunity to do something different. And if you're having good things, don't get me wrong, when your good things are happening, that's also a moment. We use that in mind training as well. We can think about, okay, I have this good thing happening. I can be grateful for it. And I can be grateful for everything that has allowed me to have that. In Buddhist terms, again, the good karma I created that ripened into that. I can even think about others when I'm having that good thing, and think about how wonderful it would be if every being had good stuff in their lives, had things that brought them joy, brought them happiness in the way that I'm experiencing that now. Every moment is an opportunity to transform our minds. And that's what we'll see, especially when we get into the section of being grateful for the garbage, grateful for the suffering. Here we are, grateful for life's difficulties. So the Dalai Lama, even suffering helps you to develop empathy and compassion for others. Exile really has brought me closer to reality. As he was living up in the Potala and Lhasa and all of the comforts that he had there, and being in that enclosed environment, very easy to kind of shut yourself off to the suffering of others. But once you are in a situation where you're suffering yourself, it's an opportunity to open up to others. When you are in difficult situations, there's no room for pretense. In adversity or tragedy, you must confront reality as it is. The Archbishop had described earlier in the week how Nelson Mandela had been transformed while he was in prison. Mandela and his fellow political prisoners had used their time to develop their mind and their character so that they would someday be ready to rule the country. They had seen it as an informal university. He didn't spend his time in prison just being depressed every day, and feeling horrible about what had happened. He said, okay, this is my opportunity to really work on developing my knowledge and abilities and whatever. So when I leave here at some point, I can be of greater use. It's where oftentimes I remember Venerable Robina, who I've mentioned, she started our Liberation Prison Project, which was going into prisons and visit men and women in prison. Generally men, tended to be more men, simply because of the facilities and what have you. But also we have a correspondence program, writing to prisoners. But the advice that came down, I think, from Lama Zopa that she would channel to prisoners frequently was to use your time in prison as a retreat. It's might think not ideal conditions for retreat because they're awful, noisy, horrible places in many ways. But think of it in that manner. Again, perspective. Are you going to look at your time in prison as torture and punishment, or are you going to look at it as retreat? So, wow, I get to go on retreat for however many years. All expenses paid, right? You don't even have to pay the exorbitant fees that a lot of retreat centers charge. Anyway, but so and I remember she even tells a story about a woman. Somehow she got picked up by these people who were going to rob a filling station, and in the process of them robbing the filling station, she was in the car, not even knowing this was going to go on. They killed somebody, and in Florida, there's a law that anyone who is involved in it gets the same sentence, regardless of whether they pulled the trigger or whatever. She ended up in prison, really falsely accused, but there was nothing she could do really. And so she realized that banging her head against the situation and not accepting it and not learning to work with it was not working. And so she did a similar thing. I think this whole article was in like Esquire or something. Venerable Rabina, I'm sure she knows where she read it. I don't know the woman's name or anything, or I'd look it up, but she said that she came to that conclusion. She had to accept that this is what was going on and make the best use of it. Almost be grateful for it. Okay, here I am. What can I do? I can't get out of prison right now. I think she was going through all these appeals processes and what have you, but those take time, years, sometimes. So she just decided I'm going to use my time really well. And I think Anthony Hinton's story that I'll be sharing shortly is also in that same vein to some degree. Being grateful for your enemies. In Buddhism, you can do that, calling them, often we think of them as our most precious spiritual teachers because they help us develop our spiritual practice and to cultivate equanimity, even in the face of adversity. Equanimity is seeing everyone through an equal lens, even-mindedness, embracing them all as suffering sentient beings that are worthy of our compassion and love. The Dalai Lama's story about his friend losing his compassion for his torturers in the Chinese gulag was a poignant example. Perhaps you've heard this story. His Holiness, again, often greets the people who come from Tibet. I mentioned that previously, and they tell him these stories. And one man came in, I think he was a monk. Maybe he wasn't, I'm not sure, but he came in and His Holiness said, tell me what you had to deal with and, just give me an idea of what your story is. And he talked about how much, torture he had to endure in the Chinese prisons, all the horrible things that happened to him. And, he said, the Dalai Lama kind of asked him, well, this sounds like you were really in a lot of danger. And he said, oh, yes, I was in danger of losing my compassion for my captors. That was the thought that he had. He wasn't highlighting all the horrible stuff that happened to him. He was saying this was all happening to him, and it was causing him to almost lose his compassion for those captors. I mean, that's a pretty advanced mind. That's way beyond where I'm at, But once more, you can be grateful for enemies because they show you where you're at in your spiritual practice. Can I really generate that kind of gratitude for someone who is doing something, again, that is harmful to me as an opportunity to test my spiritual practice, to develop my spiritual practice? Again, going back to those wonderful 8 verses that can't help but plug the 8 verses trail. It's a wonderful little thing to go on and actually sit in front of each one and contemplate it. There's 3 different verses that deal with kind of people who are in that camp. Verse 4, whenever I see beings who are wicked in nature and overwhelmed by violent negative actions and suffering, I shall hold such rare ones dear as if I had found a precious treasure. Wow. Those people who are really kind of wicked in nature, overwhelmed by suffering, they're our precious treasures. It's a bit of this one. The 5th verse, when out of envy others mistreat me with abuse and insults and abuse, I shall hold such rare ones dear. No, that's the phrase from the 4. No. When I shall offer them the victory, and I'm losing the words on that one. Sorry. When out of envy others mistreat me with insults and abuse, I shall accept defeat and offer the victory to others. How many times do we want the victory for ourselves and we can't possibly think about giving it to someone else, even in an argument we're having with somebody where we know we're right? Anyway, I could do another story about that, but I won't because we're getting kind of late here. The last of these verses that pertain to kind of working with difficult situations is, in my estimation, the hardest. When someone whom I have benefited and in whom I have great trust gives me terrible harm, I shall regard that person as my most holy guru. You know, when the person who by all rights should be standing up for us and doing things to us that are beneficial for us, they take a crap on our doorstep and we're like, okay, where'd that come from? Again, whose dung is that? This is actually an opportunity for us to see those people as our guru. When someone that's in that category, we've taken care of them, we nurture them, we love them, we've done things for them, we bought things for them, and they do something that's really horrible to us. Wow. Again, this is part of our Mahayana mind training. This is something we need to learn to see that these people, once more, we even actually need in our lives. We need to have that kind of challenge in our face to say, okay, where's my practice now? How can we see a deeper sense of patience and even compassion for people in the face of that? This is the quote that I was trying to remember earlier today, I think it was, from Khalil Gibran. I have learned silence from the talkative, tolerance from the intolerant, and kindness from the unkind. Yet strange, I am ungrateful to these teachers. It's a really wonderful phrase, but can we have some gratitude for the people who are unkind to us, who are talkative, who are intolerant, who are doing whatever that it is that annoys us, and say, wow, that's somebody I really need to pay attention to. There's that interesting story about Lama Atisha. Did I say this the other night? I don't know. Maybe the tea boy, the Bengali tea boy. I guess I did say it the other night. I'll say it again. This may have been on Wednesday night, but um, I'm not sure. I might have been on Wednesday though. I don't know. Were you? Anyway, the story is Lama Atisha, this great Indian master, 1,000 years ago, is living in India. And the king of Tibet invited him to come to Tibet to live and to teach because he really wanted to reinvigorate the Dharma there in Tibet. So he made the arduous journey of crossing all the way over the Himalayas and getting into Tibet, the Tibetan Plateau, and what have you. And it said that when he left, he decided to bring this Bengali tea boy who was really annoying. It was like he knew Atisha's buttons and he pushed them very frequently. And why he did it was because he wanted to have somebody who played this role for him. And he was afraid he would get to Tibet and the Tibetan people would all be smiley and wonderful and nice and kind, and he wouldn't have that. I mean, who goes on vacation essentially with the person who annoys you? I mean, that's what he was doing. He wasn't going on vacation, but he was going on this long trip over to Tibet with somebody who was going to push his buttons all the time because he wanted to have that practice. Again, might sound a little weird because once more you go to that place of, well, why did Lama Tisha make this young guy do all of these things that were harmful towards him and create the karma of that? Don't overthink it. It's a story. It's meant to exemplify that we shouldn't look at those people and shun them and want to be away from them. We should be drawn towards them because we see that they're a great opportunity of practice. For how long? I don't know how long it went on, but that's a question with all of our things. How long do we need to be with that person? Maybe until we can be with them without any anger or anything arising. And maybe Lama Atisha just hadn't quite gotten there yet. Yeah. Till we learn the lesson. Yeah. You keep coming around till you get it right. The story is concluded by saying that when he got to Tibet, he realized he didn't need to bring the Bengali tea boy, that there were plenty of annoying people in Tibet that he could have just, used on his practice of patience and what have you. But this is a different level of gratitude, right? Being really grateful for the beings that do that for us, that are the unkind, are the challenges, you know? It's a tough one again. Okay, so this I will share with you. I think this one, and I might really break down on this one because this part of the book, I just really, really, it's pretty powerful. She tells this story about her experience of gratitude for her enemies, which of course were the Nazis that imprisoned her. So it might take me a minute to pull this up. Let me go to, it's the choice. I already have it on the right page. I just need to pull it up on my Zoom share. Again, a really powerful book because of her really just honesty with what she was going through at the time, and really beautiful stories that she tells in there that are painful to listen to, but nonetheless really show her humanity. Let me give a preface to this. Actually, I should do that before I put this on here. When she got to Auschwitz, one of the people that she happened to meet that was, of course, controlling a lot of what was going on was Dr. Mengele. Mengele was known as the Angel of Death, really notorious figure in, that whole time. And he was a lover of the arts, believe it or not. And she, as a 16-year-old girl from Hungary, was practicing ballet. And so he found that out about her, and he called her in to have her dance for him. It's just like kind of sick when you think about it from a human point of view, but nonetheless, this is what he was doing. This was what kind of, again. So this is what she says about as she's dancing for him. She says, "As I dance, I discover a piece of wisdom that I have never forgotten. I will never know what miracle of grace allows me this insight. It will save my life many times, even after the horror is over. I can see that Dr. Mengele, the seasoned killer who just this morning murdered my mother, is more pitiful than me. I am free in my mind, which he can never be. He will always have to live with what he's done. He is more a prisoner than I am. As I close my routine with a final graceful split, I pray, but it isn't myself I pray for. I pray for him. I pray for his sake that he won't have the need to kill me. He must be impressed by my performance because he tosses me a loaf of bread, a gesture, as it turns out, that will later save my life. As evening turns to night, I share the bread with Magda, her sister, and our bunkmates. I am grateful to have bread. I am grateful to be alive." Okay, that's the setup. This additional kind of thing that happens in the future. Let me get out of this. Whoops. What's happening here? There it goes. Let me go to my notebook and pull up that passage that kind of concludes this story. She says now that they're on the death march from Mauthausen to Gunskirchen. It is the shortest distance we have been forced to walk. This is towards the end of her time in captivity. But we are so weakened by then that only 100 out of the 2,000 of us will survive. Magda and I cling to each other, determined to stay together. By the way, they both did make it out of the concentration camp together, to stay upright. Each hour, hundreds of girls fall into the ditches on either side of the road. Too weak or too ill to keep moving, they're killed on the spot. We are like the head of a dandelion, gone to seed. Whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. How did I do that? Here I am in the middle of something that get it back on there. I hate Kindle showing it on the screen because it's really hard to get everything in the right place. I mean, I got this little thing on my screen. You can't see it. It's the little thing that happens out there. And now I get it moved out of here so that it's not in my way. All right. Okay. Too weak or too ill to keep moving. They're killed on the spot. We are like the head of a dandelion gone to seed and blown by the wind, only a few white tufts remaining. Hunger is my only name. Every part of me is in pain. Every part of me is numb. I can't walk another step. I ache so badly, I can't feel myself move. I am just a circuitry of pain, a signal that feeds back on itself. I don't know that I have stumbled until I feel the arms of Magda and the other girls lifting me. They have laced their fingers together to form a human chair. "You shared your bread," one of them says. The words don't mean anything to me. When have I ever tasted bread? But then a memory rises up. Our first night at Auschwitz. Mengele ordering the music and Mengele ordering me to dance. This body danced. This mind dreamt of the opera house. This body ate that bread. I am the one who had the thought that night and who thinks it again now. Mengele killed my mother. Mengele let me live. Now, a girl who shared a crust with me nearly a year ago has recognized me. She uses her last strength to interlace her fingers with Magda's and those of the other girls and lift me up into the air. In a way, Mengele allowed this moment to happen. He didn't kill any of us that night or any night after. He gave us bread. I mean, that's pretty profound gratitude. I mean, when you look at somebody who, again, was really heinous in their acts and the things that they did, again, a suffering sentient being like all of us, but he did things that were really atrocious. And she can see some ounce of goodness in him, some gratitude for the thing he did that allowed that to happen. And that's pretty profound. Ah, involuntarily, sure. Sure. And again, we can say that maybe there was really not much of a kind thought behind throwing the bread. But nonetheless, this is an interesting thing. You know, in Buddhism, when we start working with the idea of kindness or kindness that we can be grateful for, we start defining it a little differently in terms of it not being dependent upon the motivation of the giver of kindness, but rather upon the mere fact that we have been the recipient. You know, whenever I teach on kindness, you know, some people kind of blanch at it and say, well, you know, what are you talking about? That's not kindness at all. Because conventionally we think of kindness as being something that's quite intentional, right? I'm kind, I want to do something for you, I'm generous to you, doing things. But we benefit all the time from people who have, they don't even have us in mind at all. Once more, back in the pandemic, were we grateful for all of what we received from people that we didn't even know? People who kept growing the food and packaging the food and shipping the food and making sure that we had what we needed for our sustenance. You know, you can be grateful and see that as a kindness, even though those people don't even know you. They're not sitting in the fields, you know, harvesting the fruit and vegetables or whatever and thinking, oh, I can't wait for Don to enjoy this. You know, Don's going to really like that apple. You know, they don't know me, but it's a kindness. And that's again the same idea around enemies. Our enemies can be the kindest person to us, but it's up to us to see that kindness because they're not necessarily intending it. And they might even be intending the opposite because they might be intentionally harming us. But can we see it as a kindness? Not the same kindness as what we conventionally call kindness, but see it from the lens of being a beneficiary of what they have done. That's again a really profound movement of our minds in a direction that is liberating in many ways because then it's something that produces a lightness in ourselves because we're choosing not to see what the enemy or the difficult people are doing through the lens of that act of pain that they're inflicting upon another or whatever. We're going to see it as actually something that can be a kindness. And I love that story that she, you know, so articulately shared. And I'm read horribly, I'm sure, with all of my tearing up, but I can't imagine, again, it's a good test of our own spiritual progress. Would we be as grateful in the moment at something that had transpired at the hands of somebody who was so horrific? I don't know. Let me share the rest of this. We'll conclude gratitude, I think, tonight. And you can see her. She's such a beautiful soul. These prison stories, which were going on in that particular part of the book, this is getting into the topic of gratitude and forgiveness, reminded me of a former inmate I've had the privilege of knowing. He tells a story of Anthony Ray Hinton. I mentioned Anthony Hinton before. He spent over 30 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. He was arrested in Alabama on the basis of a witness saying that they saw him at a gas station shooting or something, grocery store shooting, and at the time, he was in a locked facility working, a warehouse working. I mean, it sounds like it wouldn't happen, but he happened to be an African American male in Alabama, and he was accused of this crime. And on the basis of this witness, neglecting, the jury must have neglected a lot of evidence that showed that he wasn't even in the locale of this. He was nearby at this factory, but because somebody identified him, probably a white person, I don't think they say that in the book, but they identified him and they believed that person and didn't believe that he actually wasn't there. 30 years on death row. And they, my God, 30, think of where you were 30 years ago. Maybe, I think everyone in here is over 30, right? So you were here, maybe? I don't know. I don't know everybody. Isabella? No. Okay, well, you were just a thought 30 years ago. 30 years is an awful long time. My gosh, that's a big part of your life. When a unanimous Supreme Court ruling ordered his release, he was finally able to walk free. One does not know the value of freedom until one has it taken away. This is then going in the direction again of gratitude. When people run out of the rain, I run into the rain. How can anything that falls from heaven not be precious? Having missed the rain for so many years, 30 years, not having a single drop of rain, I'm so grateful for every drop, just to feel it on my face. Then when Hinton was interviewed for 60 minutes, the interviewer asked him whether he was angry at those who had put him in jail. He responded that he had forgiven all the people who had sent him to jail. And it's kind of this idea of gratitude and forgiveness sort of fitting together. The interviewer was, incredulous. He says, they took 30 years of your life. How can you not be angry? He responded, if I'm angry and unforgiving, they will have taken the rest of my life. Again, the gratitude he feels now for his freedom and for having attained at least a portion of his life. He missed 30 years of being in prison. And his book, again, I think it's called The Sun Also Rises. It's The Sun Does Rise. Yes, thank you for correcting that. Yeah, it's wow. I mean, it's really powerful in and of itself, again, because he recounts the experiences he had, especially when he first got on death row. And he recognizes there's a bit of a compassion thing. We're going to get into compassion tomorrow, where he recognizes that part of what he needs to do there is to reach out to the other men who are on death row with him and to become a source of support for them. And I don't know how many men he witnessed going to execution while he was on death row. His case kept getting appealed and appealed and appealed, and eventually, the decision to let him go. So unforgiveness robs us of our ability to enjoy and appreciate our life because we're trapped in a past filled with anger and bitterness. Forgiveness allows us to move beyond the past and appreciate the present, including the drops of rain falling on our face. This is a place he got to through his own process of gratitude. This is from, The Sun Does Shine, page 239. I wake up every morning grateful to be alive and grateful to be free. I'm a voice for the men still on the row. I'm a voice for justice. I'm the poster boy for all that is broken in our prison system. But, grateful for the opportunity on the other side of that whole experience, where again, a lot of people would be pretty bitter. Took away 30 years of my life. To hell with you. How gratitude connects us. Brother David Steindl-Ross, getting to the end of our time here today. But he says, when you are grateful, you act out of a sense of enough and not out of a sense of scarcity. And you are willing to share. If you are grateful, you are enjoying the differences between people and respectful to all people. A grateful world is a happy world. We can feel that sense of connection because we once more understand the interdependence that what we have in our lives, anything we have, even the education that we have, my gosh, I'm going to probably stop pretty soon because I think we're getting kind of pooped out. But everything from like learning how to tie your shoes was due to other people taking an interest in you and helping you, right? We wouldn't even know how to feed ourselves, take a utensil and put food on it and put it in our mouth if it wasn't for our kind parents usually, or maybe grandparents or someone close teaching us how to do that. This is the truth of our lives. We're not, again, standing alone, and gratitude helps us to recognize that, to be aware of that, to actually embrace that. So let me just finish this subject and then we'll conclude for tonight. Gratitude connects us all. When we are grateful for a meal, we've been grateful for the food that we are eating and for all of those who have made the meal possible, the farmers, the grocers, the cooks, the people who ship it, the people who package it. Let's stop there. Again, we've got some wonderful practices to look at for gratitude, especially Brother David's practice. But you open it up to just a comment or two. It's at 8:30. Yes, she is. I think her sister Magda passed away just a short while ago. I actually am following her on Facebook. You can follow her if you are a Facebook person, and you'll get occasional notices that she posts and everything. I think she still even does talks here and there, and you can watch some of them. They're really quite phenomenal. Um, Again, one of the gifts of this book, like I said, is all these people that Douglas Abrams pulled in, and maybe, if you haven't read the book, by hearing me talk about it might spark some interest in reading some of these stories. I think reading other people's life stories and the things that they've had to deal with, particularly these sorts of cases, can be really quite inspiring, because many of us live a fairly gifted life, a life that is not quite immune, but certainly not filled with that type of suffering. Um, any other comments, questions? Yeah, Marty, maybe we'll get the microphone over there. Yeah, I think everyone got the question online that was about Edith Eva Egger, and if she is still alive. So anyway, yeah, Marty.
I think also what's really beautiful about that story is that she was able to break the chain of karma
Yeah.
because that she was in that situation. So sometimes, somehow, something,
Mhm.
and she just nullified it.
Yeah.
She ceased it.
Yeah, yeah. No, and from a Buddhist perspective, that's how we would see it, is that she decided she was not going to play into that and continue to perpetuate that. And she even saw it herself, not in a Buddhist lens, as I said, maybe that's when she said, it keeps me chained to the person. It keeps me involved with them. If I forgive, then I'm free. Then I'm no longer caught up in that. Mm. Yeah. Any other comments? Yes, please, Lindsay.
I just had two quick thoughts. The first was I was thinking about how much we can remember all the way back to yesterday. Um, perspective matters.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about it, whether it was humor but
Uh,
in all of these situations, it's not an ordinary perspective that people are taking here by any means, like understatement. And it seems like it does every single one of these other pillars seemingly does require being able to take a perspective beyond what you might automatically be able to take. So that was just
Mhm.
an observation. And then the other part was
Mm.
I'm also feeling like on the one hand, it's quite inspiring to hear these people who are like mind-blowingly accomplished in their cultivation of these qualities. And on the other hand, it feels
Uh,
far
Far
or
away.
extreme in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I don't know if others feel that way, but it just it was just striking me that way too.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate both of those comments. And I think, again, perspective, we see why it is first, certainly, because if we don't change that, then we're going to fall back into the habitual ways of looking at things, thinking about things, the self-centeredness, all the other stuff, and we're going to continue to act in the same way. But I also think that, we'd be surprised when we were put in if any of us were put in a situation, what might surprise ourselves, what resources we have within ourselves that are maybe we're blind to right now. I don't know. I mean, again, I'll go back to my own experience around the HIV epidemic in San Francisco. I got quite involved in a lot of volunteerism, beginning with just, showing up at the AIDS hotline to answer questions, and then eventually doing more closer to people with AIDS, and then eventually doing hospice work. And then my own partner started getting ill, and I was a bit more prepared because I'd done all that to actually be with him in his last months. But I was surprised at how much I was able to do that I didn't think I could do. I'll share one little story, and this one might make me cry too. But there was one time when I was lifting up Ed. He wasn't a really big guy, and he's much, much shorter than me. And I'm lifting him up in bed, and he looked up at me and he said, "I never realized how strong you were." And I took it at many different level. I'm not a strong person. I mean, these arms are like not strong at all. I was seeing him say to me, a different type of strength, an inner strength that allowed me to be there and do what I was doing with him. And I think we can surprise ourselves sometimes at how strong we can get in the face of dealing with adversity, dealing with things that are not what we would have ordered, you know? I never would have ordered that. Any of you who've lost people close to you never would have ordered it, right? You didn't want that to happen, but we rise to the occasion. So look at these things and see them maybe as examples of, yes, how far we maybe have to go, but don't also be shocked that if you're in a situation that you might be able to go the distance. You might even go further. Who knows? We might surprise ourselves. Any other comments? Oh, you're welcome. It's hard even all these years later, you know, it's still, when I teach on grief, I've done a couple of these workshops on grief, learning from grief. I use this wonderful phrase from David Kessler. I think other people have coined something very similar, but he says, our grief doesn't get smaller, we get bigger. And I think that that's very true. And those of you who are living with grief still know that it's still there. We just get bigger. We kind of grow around it and become bigger people on the basis of that. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge the losses that we've all had in our lives and continue to carry that forward. These are wounds that we all receive as we go through what we call life. And, they do have their value. So I can say definitely if it wasn't for Ed's passing, I don't know that I'd be here right now teaching, because I found Buddhism right after that. I read Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and it was like, oh, this is answering all the questions I had about life, death, everything, and it makes sense to me. And this is what I was looking for. I mean, what an incredible gift! Again, a silver lining. That's my silver lining experience. A major one for me was out of that. But anyway, this is not all about me. I'm ending up talking about myself way too much. Any final comments for tonight from someone else? Well, and again, we can see, going back to the whole topic this weekend about joy, that it's not this joy of like when your football team wins or something, if you're a football fan, or it's a different kind of subtle way that we can feel a sense of well-being and goodness in our hearts that is connected to others and is larger than ourselves. And that's what we're really aiming for all weekend with all these teachings, is to get out of this tight little mind and really see the expansiveness of an open heart and an open mind. So sounds like, yeah, what I'm saying at the end of this whole thing, but I think we're there already in terms of what we're all experiencing together in this weekend. So I'm really, really grateful once more for what all of you are contributing, because I've found this so far to be incredibly rich. And we still have 2 more pillars, and finish off gratitude, and also do the 2 other pillars of compassion and generosity. Again, 2 really big ones. And we'll do that tomorrow morning. Let's do a little dedication. Here in dedicating tonight, we can even think about those beings that we know right now that are going through difficulty. I just received news of a very dear friend of mine, Venerable Joan Nysel, whose father passed away earlier this week, and the funeral was actually today. And so I'm thinking of her, but we each have, beings who are in our lives, or that we've heard of, that we know of, or even places in the world right now where there is great suffering, from the hurricanes or from the wars or whatever it is that moves us. Just let your heart open to those places and think that what you're doing here tonight, you're kind of taking that, all that positive stuff, and you're just sharing it with those beings. You're sending it out to them. It kind of rains down on them, and it completely cleanses and purifies all of their suffering and difficulty. And it brings them everything that will ripen into their happiness, their ultimate well-being, all the conditions that they need to find temporal happiness and ultimate happiness. And through what we've done here, especially today, may this become a cause for ourselves and all beings to attain that same state, freedom from suffering and complete, full peace and happiness. Okay. good enough for today. You all kept the energy going, which is great. You know, I know it's very hard in these evening classes. Thank you all again online who have joined for the day. Very dedicated folks that have stuck in there online as well. So we will start again at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. We have a similar morning schedule. So we'll go from 9 till 10:15-ish or so. I'll probably need a little more time to get through these last two. And then we will have a break till 11, and then we'll go 11 to 12:30. We will have our lunch, and then we will say goodbye. So, all right, sleep well, everyone. Again, the homework is just to think about what we've gone through here. Again, if there's something in particular that interests you that you want to spend more time looking at, thinking about, then that's your permission to do that. All right. All right. Oh,